Nobody laughed when Ethan Caldwell talked about quantum physics. They laughed when the waitress corrected him. The words landed so softly that at first, no one was sure they had heard them. Then the room froze. Crystal glasses hovered halfway to lips. Conversations stalled in mid-sentence. Even the quiet piano music drifting through the private dining hall seemed to lose its place for a second. High above downtown San Francisco, on the 42nd floor of the Meridian Crown Hotel, some of the most powerful investors in America had gathered for a private technology summit. The room glowed beneath amber chandeliers. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a skyline stitched together by ambition and money. Every table held executives, venture capitalists, researchers, and industry leaders worth billions of dollars combined. At the center stood Ethan Caldwell, the billionaire CEO everyone had come to see. At 41, Ethan was the face of one of the fastest-growing quantum computing companies in the world. Tall, confident, dressed in a perfectly tailored navy suit. He spoke with the calm certainty of a man accustomed to being the smartest person in every room. Investors listened carefully whenever he spoke. Reporters quoted him. Universities invited him to keynote events. Tonight was supposed to be another victory lap. Ethan stood beside a massive digital display explaining how quantum entanglement would revolutionize cybersecurity, medicine, and artificial intelligence. His voice carried effortlessly across the room. The audience nodded along. Pens moved across notepads. A few guests quietly recorded clips for social media. Then it happened. Near the back of the room, balancing a silver tray filled with sparkling water and champagne flutes, stood a young black waitress named Nia Brooks. Most people hadn't noticed her. They rarely noticed the staff. She moved quietly between tables, collecting empty glasses and replacing napkins with practiced efficiency. To the guests, she was simply part of the background. Another employee making the evening run smoothly. But when Ethan reached a particular slide and confidently explained a concept involving quantum entanglement, Nia's eyes narrowed slightly. Her pace slowed. She glanced at the screen. Then she looked back at Ethan. Something wasn't right. For a brief moment she hesitated. The safe choice was silence. The smart choice was silence. Nobody came to a billionaire's presentation expecting corrections from the catering staff. Yet the words escaped before she could stop them. Actually, that's not how entanglement works. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. The sentence floated across the room with remarkable clarity. A dozen heads turned instantly. Someone near the front laughed. Another investor smirked. Within seconds, the reaction spread through the audience like a ripple across water. Amused smiles appeared everywhere. A few people exchanged looks of disbelief. One executive nearly choked on his drink, trying to suppress a laugh. Ethan himself paused mid-presentation. For the first time all evening, his rhythm broke. Slowly, he turned toward the back of the room. His expression remained polite, but the surprise in his eyes was impossible to miss. The waitress stood completely still. One hand rested against the tray. The other hung calmly at her side. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't trying to embarrass him. She simply looked at the screen as though she had spotted a typo in a menu. The laughter continued for several seconds before fading into an uncomfortable silence. Ethan studied her carefully. Around them, the room waited. Investors leaned forward. Phones quietly rose above tabletops. Nobody knew it yet, but the most important conversation of the night had just begun. And the only person who seemed completely calm was the woman wearing the name tag that read, Nia Brooks. Nia Brooks had spent most of her life becoming invisible. Not because she lacked talent, not because she lacked ambition, but because the world had become very good at deciding who mattered before a person ever spoke. The silence hanging over the ballroom felt heavier now. More than 300 people were looking at her, trying to fit her into a story that made sense. A waitress was supposed to carry trays. A waitress was supposed to smile politely and disappear into the background. A waitress was not supposed to challenge a billionaire chief executive officer in front of investors managing billions of dollars. Ethan Caldwell remained standing beside the digital display. His expression was calm, but his attention never left her. Years of boardroom negotiations had taught him how to hide surprise. Yet even he seemed unsure what to do next. Nia could feel every eye in the room measuring her, judging her, waiting for her to become embarrassed and back away. Instead, she simply adjusted the silver tray in her hands. Her breathing remained steady. Across the room, a venture capitalist quietly whispered to the person beside him. Another guest pulled out a phone and started recording. The room had stopped being about quantum computing. Now it was about her. Most people would have panicked. Most people would have apologized immediately. Nia did neither, because moments like this were not new to her. She had learned years ago that confidence sounds different when it comes from someone people underestimate. The same words that sounded intelligent from one person could sound offensive from another. The difference was rarely knowledge. It was expectation. Few people knew anything about Nia's life outside the hotel. They did not know about the small apartment she rented 20 minutes away. They did not know about the stacks of worn notebooks covering her dining room table. They did not know about the textbooks filled with handwritten notes and highlighted formulas. Every night after finishing long shifts, she returned home and studied until sunrise painted pale gold across her window. While others watched television or scrolled through social media, Nia filled page after page with equations, theories, and questions. Not because anyone asked her to, because she loved understanding how the universe worked. Some people collected art. Some collected luxury watches. Nia collected ideas. She had spent years teaching herself concepts most people never encountered. Quantum mechanics, particle theory, advanced mathematics, scientific journals that even highly educated readers often avoided. Yet none of that was visible beneath a black service uniform and a simple name tag. Appearances are powerful things. They can become walls. And walls are dangerous because eventually people stop looking beyond them. Ethan finally broke the silence. His voice remained professional. "You believe there is an error?" A few nervous laughs echoed through the ballroom. Nia nodded once. Nothing dramatic. Nothing arrogant. Just certainty. Another silence followed. This one longer. More uncomfortable. Somewhere near the front, a professor from Stanford University slowly folded his arms. His eyes narrowed with curiosity. Unlike the investors around him, he was not amused. He was interested. He had spent decades around scientists and researchers. He recognized a particular look when someone truly understood a subject. Nia had that look now. Not excitement, not fear. Focus. The kind that appears when knowledge collides with opportunity. Around them, the city lights shimmered beyond the glass walls. The piano player had quietly stopped performing. Even the hotel staff paused their work. Nobody wanted to miss what came next, because for the first time all evening, the smartest person in the room might not have been standing on the stage. Ethan Caldwell had built a billion-dollar reputation on two things: intelligence and control. He rarely raised his voice. He rarely showed anger. And he never allowed himself to be embarrassed in public. That was why the smile appearing on his face concerned a few people more than if he had looked upset. It was calm, polished, strategic, the kind of smile that appeared when a chess player spotted an opening 3 moves ahead. He stepped away from the digital display and clasped his hands together. Around the ballroom, anticipation spread through the crowd. Investors shifted in their seats. Phones remained raised. Nobody wanted to miss the next move. Ethan looked directly at Nia. "That is a confident statement," he said. His tone remained friendly enough to draw a few chuckles from the audience. Especially considering the topic. More laughter followed. Nia did not react. She stood quietly near the back of the room, the silver tray still balanced effortlessly in one hand. The contrast between them could not have been greater. One stood on a stage worth millions of dollars. The other wore a uniform most guests had barely noticed until 10 minutes ago. Ethan slowly paced across the platform. Quantum mechanics is not exactly light reading. Several investors smiled. A few nodded in agreement. Most people spend years studying it. Another wave of laughter rolled through the room. Nia remained silent. Ethan noticed. That surprised him. Usually people folded under pressure. Usually they searched for an exit, an apology, an excuse. She did neither. The silence seemed to strengthen her rather than weaken her. For the first time that evening, Ethan felt a flicker of curiosity beneath his confidence. Who was she? More importantly, why was she so certain? The Stanford professor sitting near the front continued watching carefully. His attention never left Nia. Years spent teaching brilliant students had sharpened his instincts. Something about her composure did not fit the story everyone else was telling themselves. Ethan returned to the center of the stage and glanced at the audience. Perhaps we should clarify the disagreement. The room immediately quieted. This was becoming entertainment now.
Un spectacle.
A billionaire chief executive officer versus a hotel waitress. Nobody expected the outcome to be complicated. Ethan gestured toward the giant screen displaying the equation behind his presentation. Would you like to explain what you believe is incorrect? The invitation sounded polite, generous even. But beneath the surface, another purpose existed. Ethan wanted the room to see the difference between expertise and confidence. He wanted the moment resolved. Cleanly, publicly. He expected a vague answer, a misunderstanding, quick retreat. Nia studied the screen for several seconds before speaking. The explanation is oversimplified. Her voice remained calm. The way you described the correlation could lead investors to assume information is being transferred directly. Several faces around the room turned toward Ethan. The laughter faded almost instantly. The statement sounded specific, technical, uncomfortably technical. Ethan kept smiling. But now he was listening, truly listening. A venture capitalist near the front lowered his phone and leaned forward. Another guest stopped typing on a tablet. The room was changing. Slowly, almost imperceptibly. Curiosity was replacing amusement. Ethan noticed it too. That was when he made a decision. If she wanted to challenge him, he would let her continue. Not because he believed she was right. Because he believed she was about to prove herself wrong. Publicly. Completely. He nodded toward the massive display. Interesting observation, he said. Then perhaps you can help us all understand the difference. The room became silent again. Not the polite silence of wealthy guests waiting for a presentation. This was something else. A sharper silence. A waiting silence. The kind that appears right before a moment nobody planned for. And somewhere beyond the glass walls, the lights of San Francisco shimmered against the night sky, while an entire ballroom waited to discover whether Nia Brooks was about to become the evening's joke or its biggest surprise. Nia Brooks could feel the attention of every person in the ballroom, but her focus never drifted from the equation glowing across the 70-inch display behind Ethan Caldwell. Most people saw symbols. She saw assumptions. Most people saw complexity. She saw a flaw hidden inside confidence. The silence stretched for several seconds. Nobody moved. Nobody reached for a drink. Even the hotel staff stood motionless along the walls. The Stanford professor finally leaned forward in his chair. His fingers rested beneath his chin as though he were evaluating a doctoral defense rather than watching a hotel employee challenge one of the most recognizable names in technology. Ethan gestured toward the screen. "Please," he said with practiced politeness. "Go ahead." A few guests exchanged amused looks. They still expected the moment to collapse under its own weight. After all, quantum mechanics was not dinner table conversation. It was one of the most difficult fields in modern science. Yet Nia stepped forward. Not dramatically, not nervously, simply with the calm pace of someone walking toward something familiar. The soft click of her shoes against the polished floor seemed unusually loud in the silence. She carefully set her tray onto a nearby service station and approached the edge of the presentation area. Several investors instinctively lifted their phones higher. Others shifted closer in their seats. Ethan remained composed, though a subtle tension had appeared around his eyes. Nia stopped several feet from the display and studied the equation again. Then she pointed toward a section near the center. "The issue begins here," she said. Her voice was steady, clear. The model assumes a correlation structure that creates the appearance of information transfer. But entanglement does not work that way. A murmur passed through the audience. Not because they understood the explanation, because she sounded like someone who did. Ethan responded immediately. The simplification was intentional. This is an investor presentation. Nia nodded. I understand that. Her answer came without hostility. But simplifying and misrepresenting are not the same thing. The room reacted differently this time. Nobody laughed. Several faces turned toward Ethan. Others looked back at the screen. The atmosphere had shifted. The Stanford professor slowly sat forward. Interesting, he said quietly, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. The word spread through the room almost as quickly as the earlier laughter. Interesting. That single word carried weight when it came from someone who had spent 30 years teaching theoretical physics. Ethan heard it too. He maintained his smile. Yet internally something had changed. He no longer viewed Nia as an interruption. He viewed her as a variable. Unexpected, uncomfortable, potentially dangerous to the certainty he had built the evening around. Then a voice emerged from one of the investor tables. It belonged to Martin Reeves, a venture capitalist known for asking difficult questions during presentations. If she believes the model has a problem, he said, looking toward Ethan, then perhaps we should hear the alternative. The suggestion landed like a stone dropped into still water. Heads turned instantly. Several guests nodded. Others looked intrigued. Ethan glanced toward Martin, then toward Nia. The room was no longer waiting for him to dismiss her. It was waiting to hear her. The realization settled across the ballroom. Slowly, powerfully, Nia had crossed an invisible line. Minutes earlier she had been background scenery. Now she was part of the conversation. Beyond the glass walls, the lights of San Francisco sparkled against the dark bay. Inside, a room filled with billionaires, professors, executives, and investors sat suspended between certainty and curiosity. And for the first time all night, the person controlling the direction of the conversation was not standing on the stage. She was standing beside it. Nobody spoke when Martin Reeves made the suggestion. The silence itself became an answer. Dozens of investors, executives, and researchers looked from Ethan Caldwell to Nia Brooks and back again. What had started as a brief interruption had become the center of the evening. Ethan stood perfectly still. Years of experience allowed him to hide discomfort behind professionalism, but even he understood the risk now. If he refused, it would look defensive. If he agreed, he would be giving a hotel waitress the floor in front of some of the most influential people in technology. For a long second, he weighed both options. Then he nodded. Very well, he said. Show us. A soft murmur spread through the ballroom. Nia walked toward the display. Her movements were calm, almost ordinary, yet every eye followed her. The massive screen cast a blue glow across the room as she approached the control panel. The Stanford professor sat forward so quickly that his chair nearly scraped across the floor. Several guests lowered their drinks completely. Nobody wanted a distraction. Nia studied the equation one final time. Then she reached toward the digital interface and made a small adjustment. One symbol disappeared. Another appeared in its place. The change looked insignificant to most people. But the professor's eyebrows immediately rose. Nia continued. She highlighted a section of the model and traced a line connecting two variables. The problem begins here, she explained. This assumption creates a shortcut that does not actually exist. Her voice remained steady. No arrogance. No performance. Just clarity. She modified another section. Then another. The room watched in complete silence. 40 seconds passed. Then 60. Then 90. Nobody checked a phone. Nobody whispered. Even the waitstaff remained frozen near the walls. Something extraordinary was happening. Not because Nia was speaking loudly, because she was making an extremely complicated subject sound simple. More importantly, she was making sense. The Stanford professor suddenly stood. The movement startled several guests. He walked closer to the screen, studying the revised model. His eyes moved rapidly across the equations. Then he looked at Nia, then back at the display. Finally, he exhaled. Good Lord, he said quietly. The words were barely above a whisper, but they carried through the ballroom. Every head turned toward him. The professor shook his head in disbelief. She is right. The room seemed to lose its air. Several investors exchanged stunned looks. One executive slowly removed his glasses as if seeing the screen differently might change the outcome. Martin Reeves leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. Ethan remained standing near the stage, outwardly composed, internally recalculating everything. Nia stepped away from the display and allowed the room to absorb what had happened. The corrected model now glowed across the screen where Ethan's original version had been moments earlier. The difference appeared small. Yet, according to one of the most respected physicists in the room, the implications were enormous. The laughter from earlier felt very far away now. Nobody was looking at Nia's uniform anymore. Nobody cared about the tray she had been carrying. In less than 2 minutes, the woman many people had dismissed as background staff had become the most respected voice in the room. And the most shocking part was that she looked completely unsurprised by it. The silence that followed felt different from every silence that had come before it. Earlier, people had been waiting for Nia Brooks to make a mistake. Now they were waiting to understand who she really was. Conversations began in whispers. Phones moved faster. Screens lit up across the ballroom as investors, researchers, and executives searched for answers. Ethan Caldwell noticed it immediately. People were no longer looking at him. They were looking up her name. The Stanford professor remained near the display, still studying the corrected model. Then something shifted in his expression. His eyes narrowed. Recognition flickered across his face. He looked at Nia again, this time not as a waitress, but as someone he thought he might have seen before. "Brooks," he said quietly. "Nia Brooks." The room listened. The professor took out his phone and scrolled rapidly through a series of academic publications. A few seconds later he stopped. His eyes widened. "That is impossible." The words traveled through the room almost instantly. Martin Reeves stood from his chair. Several investors moved closer. Ethan remained silent. The professor turned his screen toward the people nearest him. At the top appeared a research paper published 5 years earlier in one of the most respected physics journals in the country. Listed among the authors was a name that suddenly seemed very familiar. Nia Brooks. A wave of confusion swept through the ballroom. Another search followed. Then another. More papers appeared. More citations. More references. One executive gasped softly. A venture capitalist shook his head in disbelief. The woman serving drinks at a luxury hotel had once been part of groundbreaking research in quantum systems. The discovery spread through the room like electricity. Nia stood quietly while everyone else reacted. She looked almost uncomfortable with the attention. That alone made the revelation feel even more genuine. People who chase recognition usually know how to perform for it. Nia seemed to wish the spotlight would disappear entirely. "You worked at Berkeley?" someone asked from the audience. Another voice followed immediately. "You were part of the Quantum Systems Initiative?" A third person added. "Your work was cited by 3 major laboratories." The questions came from every direction. Nia hesitated before answering. A long time ago, the simplicity of the response only deepened the mystery. Ethan listened carefully. For the first time that evening, uncertainty entered his thoughts. He knew many of the names now appearing on investor screens. He knew how difficult it was to publish in those journals. He knew how competitive those programs were. None of it made sense. Someone with credentials like hers should have been leading research teams, advising governments, or teaching at top universities, not carrying trays between investor tables. The contradiction hung over the ballroom like a storm cloud. Finally, Martin Reeves asked the question everyone was thinking. "If you were doing work at that level," he said, "what happened?" The room became silent again. Not the silence of skepticism. Not the silence of judgment. This was curiosity. Genuine curiosity. Nia looked down briefly before lifting her eyes toward the skyline beyond the glass. Thousands of city lights stretched into the distance. For a moment she seemed far away. Then she took a slow breath. Whatever answer she was about to give would explain far more than physics. It would explain the path that had brought her to this room in the first place. For several seconds, Nia Brooks did not answer. The city lights reflected across the glass behind her, turning the skyline into a sea of gold and silver. The room remained completely still. People who spent their lives talking suddenly had nothing to say. Investors worth billions of dollars waited for a waitress to explain a decision they could not understand. Nia finally looked back toward the audience. "My mother got sick," she said softly. The simplicity of the sentence landed harder than any complicated explanation could have. A few guests lowered their eyes. Others leaned forward. Nia continued. "It started during my second year in the program. At first, everyone thought treatment would be quick. Then months became years. Nobody interrupted. The ballroom felt smaller now, more human, less like a gathering of executives and more like a room full of people remembering their own families. The research continued," Nia said. "The publications continued. The opportunities kept coming. But eventually there were appointments every week. Then every few days. Then every day." She paused briefly. Someone had to be there. Across the room, several faces softened. The Stanford professor looked down at the floor. Ethan Caldwell remained motionless, listening more carefully than he had listened to anyone in months. Nia explained how offers arrived from prestigious laboratories and private companies. Positions many scientists would spend their entire careers chasing. Yet every opportunity came with the same condition. Leave, relocate, travel, commit completely. "I could build a career," she said quietly, "or I could stay with my mother. I could not do both." The room absorbed every word. No dramatic music played. No presentation slide appeared. Just the truth. And sometimes the truth carries more weight than any performance. "So I stayed." Her answer was almost a whisper, yet nobody missed it. Nia explained how she took temporary work to cover medical expenses. Then more work. Then more. 1 year became 2. 2 became 5. Research papers turned into old files stored in boxes. Conferences became memories. Professional titles disappeared. Responsibilities remained. Through it all, she kept studying, kept reading, kept learning. Not because anyone was watching, because knowledge had never been a career for her. It had been part of who she was. Ethan felt something unfamiliar settling into his thoughts. It was not guilt exactly. It was perspective. Earlier that evening, he had seen a waitress challenging his presentation. Now he saw a person who had sacrificed opportunities he himself would have considered impossible to refuse. The difference mattered. Around the ballroom, phones slowly lowered. Nobody was recording anymore. The story had moved beyond entertainment. Martin Reeves folded his hands together and shook his head slightly. "You gave all of that up?" he asked. Nia smiled gently. "No," she replied. "I postponed it." The answer lingered in the air, powerful, quiet, unshaken. In that moment, many people realized something important. Nia Brooks had never lost her brilliance. The world had simply stopped looking for it. And as Ethan Caldwell watched her standing beneath the glow of the ballroom lights, he began to understand that the biggest mistake made that night was never about quantum physics. It was about assuming that greatness always arrives wearing the title people expect. What happened next surprised even the people who thought the evening could no longer surprise them. The conversation did not return to Ethan Caldwell's presentation. It moved toward Nia Brooks. Naturally, inevitably, like a compass finding true north. Questions came from every corner of the ballroom. A venture capitalist wanted her opinion on quantum encryption. A research director asked about error correction. Someone from a major technology fund wanted to know how she viewed the future of scalable quantum systems. One after another, the questions arrived. And one after another, Nia answered them. Not with jargon designed to impress. Not with rehearsed speeches. With clarity, confidence, understanding. The kind that cannot be memorized. The kind that only comes from years of study. The room transformed before anyone fully realized it was happening. Earlier, Investors had arranged themselves around Ethan. Now small groups quietly shifted their chairs toward Nia. People who had spent the evening waiting for a chance to speak with a billionaire chief executive officer suddenly found themselves waiting for a chance to speak with a waitress. The reversal was subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. Martin Reeves invited Nia to sit at his table. Another investor immediately offered her a seat closer to the front. A professor from Stanford asked if she would consider visiting his department. Every few minutes another opportunity appeared. Another introduction. Another conversation. Ethan watched it all unfold. There was no hostility in the room. No humiliation. Just a simple and undeniable reality. Attention follows value. And tonight, value had revealed itself in an unexpected place. Across the ballroom, several executives began discussing the corrected model Nia had presented earlier. What impressed them was not merely that she had identified a problem. It was how quickly she had solved it. One investor estimated that the adjustment could influence decisions involving hundreds of millions of dollars in future development. Another remarked that most specialists would have needed hours to recognize what she noticed in less than 2 minutes. Meanwhile, Nia remained remarkably unchanged. She answered questions politely. She thanked people for their interest. She listened as much as she spoke. The attention never seemed to inflate her ego. If anything, it made her more careful, more thoughtful, more aware of every word. That humility impressed the room almost as much as her intelligence. Ethan found himself standing alone near the stage where the evening had begun. For years he had believed leadership meant always being the person with the answers. Tonight he was learning something different. Sometimes leadership begins by recognizing brilliance when it appears, even when it appears wearing a name tag. The Stanford professor eventually smiled and addressed the room. "We invited investors to hear about the future of quantum technology," he said. "I think we just heard it." Laughter followed. Warm laughter this time. Respectful laughter. The kind shared among people who know they have witnessed something rare. Nia glanced around the ballroom. The same room that had barely noticed her an hour earlier was now listening to every word she said. Not because her uniform had changed. Not because her title had changed. Because the truth had finally become impossible to ignore. The woman who had entered the evening carrying a tray was now carrying the attention of the entire room. And nobody seemed interested in looking anywhere else. The evening should have ended with applause for a billionaire chief executive officer unveiling a vision of the future. Instead, it ended with something far more memorable. Ethan Caldwell stepped away from the stage and walked toward Nia Brooks. The movement immediately captured the attention of everyone in the ballroom. Conversations faded. Glasses paused halfway to tables. People watched carefully. Throughout the night, they had seen Ethan as the center of gravity in the room. Now they watched him approach the person who had quietly changed its direction. Nia turned toward him. For a moment neither spoke. The skyline shimmered beyond the windows. The city below continued its endless movement, unaware that inside a luxury ballroom, hundreds of successful people had just been reminded how easily assumptions can fail. Ethan finally smiled. Not the controlled smile of a presenter. Not the strategic smile of a negotiator. A genuine one. "I owe you an apology," he said. The room became completely silent. Many people expected congratulations. Some expected a business offer. Few expected those words. Ethan continued. "Earlier tonight, I thought I was defending my work." He glanced briefly toward the display screen before looking back at her. "Now I realize I was defending an assumption." Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. Ethan's voice remained calm. "I saw a uniform and believed I understood the person wearing it. That was my mistake." Several guests exchanged thoughtful looks. The lesson felt larger than either of them. Nia listened quietly. Then she smiled. Not with triumph. Not with satisfaction. With grace. The kind that comes from someone who no longer needs to prove anything. Ethan reached into his jacket and removed a business card. Then he paused and placed it back. The gesture surprised everyone. "No," he said with a small laugh. "A business card is not enough." More laughter followed. Warm and genuine, Ethan turned toward the audience. Tomorrow morning, my company will establish a fully funded research fellowship in quantum systems. A murmur swept through the ballroom. Ethan looked back at Nia. And if you choose to accept it, the position is yours. No conditions. No deadlines. No expectations except that you continue doing what you clearly do better than most of us. The reaction was immediate. Applause erupted across the room. Investors stood. Professors stood. Executives stood. Even members of the hotel staff joined in. The sound filled the ballroom and echoed against the glass walls overlooking San Francisco. Yet the most remarkable thing was Nia's reaction. She did not rush forward. She did not celebrate. She simply nodded and thanked him, because the opportunity mattered. But it was not the victory. The victory had happened much earlier. It happened the moment people stopped seeing her role and started seeing her value. As the applause continued, Ethan realized something that would stay with him long after the evening ended. Wealth can buy attention. Titles can buy influence. Success can buy access. But none of those things can replace character, sacrifice, or knowledge. Those must be earned. Nia Brooks entered the ballroom as someone most people overlooked. She left as someone nobody would forget. And long after the lights dimmed and the guests returned home, the lesson remained. Greatness does not announce itself with a title. Genius does not require permission. And sometimes the most extraordinary person in the room is the one nobody thought to notice.